Douglas and I spend a lot of time in this podcast, certainly most of the time, talking about the situation in Europe with respect to immigration and Islam and the social attitudes in the Muslim community that are at odds with values that really should be, really must be non-negotiable, like free speech and women's rights and gay rights. And what I'd like to point out is that neither of us are against immigration. And you might not notice that in the first hour or so. And we're not against Muslim immigration. In fact, both of us count among our friends Muslims and former Muslims who are precisely the sorts of people we are most concerned to protect. And in particular, we're worried about protecting them from many of the illiberal people who have been pouring into Europe. I know there are some things that Douglas and I disagree about. I think we have a different sense of the place of Christianity as a foundation of Western values. I don't give it much of a place at all, certainly not a contemporary one, and Douglas does, but we'll tackle that in another podcast. In this one, we more or less fully agree on what we're against. And what we're against is Western civilization committing suicide. And if you think that puts the matter too strongly, you haven't read Douglas's book, and you probably haven't been paying much attention to what's been happening in Europe. And if you think one has to be a fan of Trump in order to worry about this, well, then you haven't been paying attention to this podcast. But on the topic of Trump, Trump just gave a speech in Poland where he said, and I quote, "The fundamental question of our time is whether the West has the will to survive. Do we have the confidence in our values to defend them at any cost? Do we have enough respect for our citizens to protect our borders? Do we have the desire and the courage to preserve our civilization in the face of those who would subvert or destroy it?" End quote. And while I find abundant fault with the messenger, as you know, I can't find fault with that particular message. And the fact that liberals can't seem to see what's at stake here, the fact that they are embarrassed to defend, quote, Western values, as though that were synonymous with racism, or the legacy of colonialism, or xenophobia, or a lack of compassion, that is making liberalism politically defunct at this point. And that increasingly worries me. And happily in the United States, we are in a better situation demographically and with respect to immigration and just geographically. And that has implications for immigration. But one cannot be cheerful about what's been happening in Europe. And in his book and in this conversation, Douglas finds a path through this wilderness of competing concerns that is deeply ethical and also deeply pragmatic. And I don't think Trump comes up, or if he does, it's just in passing, so consider yourselves spared. But Douglas and I get into the fairly gloomy thesis of his very witty book, which is that what's happening in Europe is something that not even the most paranoid people would have predicted a decade ago. And it concerns all of us.